The Chukchi Sea is rarely silent. It is a vast, untamed expanse where the wind howls ceaselessly, waves crash like restless giants, and the ice groans under the weight of shifting tides. It is a place where only the most hardened seafarers dare to venture, where the unpredictability of nature is both a challenge and a way of life. But on that fateful morning, something was different. Captain William "Bill" Harding had spent over 30 years navigating these unforgiving waters, inheriting the sea's lessons from his father and grandfather before him. He knew its moods better than he knew his own. He could read a storm before the first cloud appeared, sense danger before it arrived. And that morning, everything felt. The Arctic should have been alive with movement, waves churning, gulls crying, the distant crack of shifting ice. Instead, the world had fallen into an eerie, unnatural stillness. The ocean stretched out before them like polished glass, unbroken and silent. Even the wind, which never truly slept in these waters, had vanished, leaving behind only an empty hush. Standing at the bow of the Arctic dawn, Harding felt a chill creep through him. Not from the cold, but from something deeper, something instinctive. This was the kind of quiet that sailors feared, the kind that came before something extraordinary. Behind him, Emily Carter, his first mate and longtime friend, scanned the horizon with the same wary eyes. She had spent years studying marine life, had seen the Arctic's creatures in every form, majestic, violent, struggling for survival. But even she could not explain what they were witnessing now. "There's no movement," she murmured, almost as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile silence. Jake Holloway, the ship's engineer, adjusted his thick gloves and leaned against the railing. "It's like the ocean is holding its breath," he muttered, his voice uneasy. "I don't like it." Neither did Harding. He had seen calm waters before, but this wasn't natural. It wasn't just a break in the weather. It was a pause, an unnatural vacuum, like something unseen was watching, waiting. Then, as if to break the tension, Miguel Alvarez, one of the crew members, called out from the stern, "Something's in the water." Harding turned, his seasoned instincts already telling him that whatever it was, it wouldn't be ordinary. Emily grabbed the binoculars and focused on the spot Miguel was pointing to. At first, all she saw was the shimmering reflection of the ship against the water's surface. But then, movement. A shadow just below the surface, too large to be a seal, too deliberate to be drifting ice. And then it surfaced. A massive polar bear, its white fur soaked and darkened by the freezing water, struggled against the gentle but unrelenting grip of the Arctic Sea. But something was wrong. The bear wasn't thrashing, it wasn't paddling toward shore or instinctively fighting for survival, as any animal in distress would. It was waiting. Its head lifted above the water, eyes locked onto the Arctic dawn with an intensity that sent a shiver down Harding's spine. The bear wasn't panicked. It wasn't wild with fear. It was watching them, studying them, and then, impossibly, it raised one paw out of the water. A gesture. A signal, a call for help. Captain Harding, a man who had built his life on logic, experience, and the hard-earned knowledge of the sea, felt something shift inside him. This was no ordinary rescue. This was the beginning of something no one aboard the Arctic Dawn would ever be able to explain. Captain William "Bill" Harding had seen countless rescues at sea. He had pulled stranded fishermen from frigid waters, guided lost vessels through Arctic storms, and even helped free a tangled whale once, but never, not in 30 years, had he seen anything like this. The polar bear was waiting. It didn't fight the waves, it didn't panic, it didn't even attempt to swim toward the ship. It just held its position, staring up at them with an almost human intensity. Then, in a gesture that sent a shudder through the entire crew, it lifted one massive paw out of the water, not thrashing, not desperate, but deliberate, a silent plea. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft lapping of the water against the hull. Then, as if breaking from a trance, Harding sprang into action. "Get the nets ready, now." His voice carried the weight of command, snapping the crew out of their stunned silence. Emily Carter, first mate and marine life expert, was already moving, grabbing the largest rescue net they had. Jake Holloway, the ship's engineer, began adjusting the crane, reinforcing the rigging to handle the sheer weight of a full-grown polar bear. Miguel Alvarez and Daniel Wu scrambled to secure ropes, their breaths visible in the icy air. But even as they moved, an unspoken tension filled the air. This wasn't normal. Wild animals, especially predators, didn't behave this way. When in distress, they lashed out, fought, panicked. They didn't just wait. Harding positioned the ship carefully, aligning it so that the bear drifted closer without the risk of injury. The Arctic dawn wasn't built for rescues like this. But if they hesitated, the bear wouldn't survive much longer in the freezing water. Emily leaned over the railing, holding the rescue net. "It's watching us," she whispered. And it was. Not just looking, watching, studying, understanding. Harding pushed the thoughts aside. They had a job to do. The first attempt failed. The net hit the water, but the bear was simply too heavy. As they tried to pull it up, the rope strained under the weight, groaning as the bear's mass exceeded their capacity. For a moment, Harding feared they would have to abandon the effort. But the bear didn't panic. It didn't thrash, didn't claw at the net in fear. It simply floated, its head above water, waiting. Jake adjusted the crane. "We need a second try, Captain. Stronger support." Harding nodded. "Do it." The second attempt was when everything changed. As the net was repositioned, something incredible happened. The bear, as if understanding their struggle, rolled to its side, shifting its weight, making it easier for them to slide the net underneath. Emily gasped. That's impossible." Harding didn't respond. He was too focused, too determined, but deep down, something inside him was shaking. This wasn't an animal blindly reacting. This was cooperation. The net tightened. The crane whined as it lifted the massive creature from the water. Slowly, carefully, the bear rose, water cascading from its thick fur like a frozen waterfall. And still, it did not fight. As it was hoisted onto the deck, the crew expected an explosion of movement, an instinctive panic from a wild animal suddenly trapped in a foreign environment. They braced themselves, ready to retreat if it lashed out. But what happened next defied explanation. The bear rose to its full height, towering over them, its soaked fur gleaming in the dim Arctic light. It could have attacked, it could have charged. Instead, it lowered itself back down into a seated position, calm, collected, and then it placed one massive paw over its chest. A gesture, a sign, a thank you. Emily's hands trembled. Miguel took an unconscious step back. Even Jake, the most skeptical of them all, could only stare in silent disbelief. Harding swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the freezing air. This bear, this wild, untamed predator, was acknowledging them. For the first time in his life, Harding felt the weight of something he couldn't explain, a moment beyond logic, beyond reason. He had set out to rescue this bear. But now, as the massive creature met his eyes with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine, he realized something profound. This bear hadn't just been saved. It had chosen to be. And that, he knew, was just the beginning. The deck of the Arctic Dawn was silent. Not because the crew wasn't speaking, but because none of them knew what to say. A fully grown polar bear had just been lifted from the freezing Arctic waters, brought aboard a fishing vessel, and instead of panic, aggression, or even simple fear, it had thanked them. Captain William Bill Harding had seen many things at sea, but nothing like this. The bear sat calmly on the deck, water pooling beneath its massive frame, its breath visible in the frigid air. It was watching them again, not with the wild, unpredictable gaze of an animal in distress, but with something deeper, something that felt impossibly human. Then, the first extraordinary thing happened. Miguel Alvarez was stepping back, still shaken, when his foot slipped on the slick deck. His arms flailed as he lost his balance, heading straight toward the railing. It happened in an instant, too fast for anyone to react. But the bear moved first. In a blur of motion, it shifted its weight, planting itself between Miguel and the railing. Miguel's hands instinctively grasped at something. Fur. Thick, warm, solid fur. He steadied himself, heart pounding, realizing what had just happened. The bear had caught him, stopped his fall. For a long moment, Miguel didn't move. Neither did the bear. It simply held its position, allowing him to regain his footing before calmly stepping away, as if the act had been entirely intentional. Emily Carter's breath hitched. Did anyone else just see that? No one answered, but they had all seen it. And it was only the beginning. The second sign. The ship's problem solver. As the crew worked to secure the bear, Jake Holloway was distracted by something else. A faint, rhythmic clunking sound coming from below deck. At first he ignored it, chalking it up to the usual creaks and groans of a working vessel. But the bear didn't ignore it. It turned its massive head, ears twitching, before slowly standing. The deck trembled slightly under its weight. Then, to everyone's astonishment, it moved toward the exact spot where the sound was coming from, and Jake frowned. What is it doing? The bear paused, then lifted a massive paw and began pawing at the deck at the exact point where the sound was loudest. Jake hesitated. It was absurd, but he grabbed his tools and hurried below deck. Within minutes he found it. A fuel line leak, dangerously close to rupturing. A leak none of them had noticed. The bear had pointed it out. Jake stared in disbelief. No way, he muttered, shaking his head. But there it was, undeniable. This bear understood something was wrong, and it had led them right to it. The storm and the impossible act of strength. The day's events had already defied explanation, but the most incredible moment came hours later, when the storm rolled in. The Arctic is merciless. Storms form quickly, with winds that howl like wolves and waves that rise like mountains. The Arctic dawn was caught in one of those tempests now, tossed like a toy by the raging sea. The crew fought to secure the ship, working against the elements, battling the wind, the freezing spray. The bear, still on deck, crouched low, claws gripping the planks, seemingly unbothered by the chaos around it. Then, a disaster nearly struck. A heavy storage crate broke free, skidding across the deck, heading straight for the ship's control room. If it crashed into the glass, it could shatter the instruments, disable their navigation in the middle of a storm. There was no time to react. No time for the crew to stop it. But the bear did. In one swift motion, it lunged forward, catching the crate with its massive arms. The impact should have knocked it back, should have sent it skidding across the slick deck. But it didn't move. It held firm. The crew watched in awe as the bear, with calculated strength, held the crate in place until Jake and Miguel could properly secure it. Only then, only when it was safe, did the bear release its grip and step back. Jake wiped his face, half from rain, half from pure disbelief. That didn't just happen, Emily whispered. I think it did. The final proof, a gesture of compassion. By the time the storm calmed, the Arctic dawn was battered but intact. The crew was exhausted, but something unspoken had settled between them. This bear, it wasn't just an animal. It wasn't just intelligent. It understood. And then, as if to remove any last doubt, it did one final thing. David Wu, still shaken, had been documenting everything on his phone. His fingers were numb from the cold, but he held on, recording every moment. Then he caught it. The bear approaching the freshwater container they had left on deck. It had been hours since its rescue. It had to be thirsty. But it didn't drink. Instead, it pushed the container first to Captain Harding, then to Emily, then to Jake, Miguel, and David. One by one, it made sure each of them had water before taking its own sip. A stunned silence followed. This wasn't survival instinct. This wasn't training. This was something deeper. Captain Harding, a man who had always relied on logic, felt his worldview shift. This bear wasn't just a creature of the wild. It was something more. And whatever that more was, they were only beginning to understand it. As the storm faded and the Arctic dawn finally settled into calm waters, the crew found themselves in an unspoken state of awe. For hours, they had witnessed the impossible. A wild polar bear displaying intelligence, cooperation, even acts of compassion. It had saved Miguel from falling overboard, detected a critical fuel leak, and prevented a storage crate from wrecking their navigation equipment. And then, as if to remove all doubt that it was something extraordinary, it had shared its water before drinking itself. Now, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the icy expanse, one truth became clear. It was time to let the bear go. The unspoken bond. Captain William "Bill" Harding had released animals before, whales entangled in fishing lines, seals trapped in nets. But this was different. This was personal. As the crew gathered near the stern, the bear sat in its usual way, calm, watchful, present. It had been with them less than a day, but its presence now felt as natural as any member of the crew. Emily Carter adjusted her gloves, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I almost don't want to let it go," she admitted. Miguel Alvarez nodded. "Feels wrong, like we're saying goodbye to more than just an animal." Jake Holloway, ever the skeptic, exhaled sharply. "We have to, though. It belongs out there." He gestured toward the distant ice floes, where the bear's true home awaited. Harding watched the bear for a long moment, then gave the order. "Lower the ramp." Miguel and Jake worked quickly, releasing the mechanism that would allow the bear to step onto the floating ice. It would be free to leave, whenever it chose. But it didn't move. The bear's message. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, the bear turned its head, looking at each member of the crew one by one, holding eye contact. There was something in its gaze, something knowing. It stood slowly, towering once more, and then, in an act that sent chills through everyone, it mimicked them. One massive paw rose to its chest. Then it stretched outward, the same gesture it had made before. A gesture of gratitude. Emily gasped softly, "It's thanking us again." Miguel wiped his face. "Damn, this is unreal." But the bear wasn't done. As it stepped toward the ramp, it suddenly stopped, turning back toward the deck. Its gaze scanned the area before settling on a broken wooden plank, a remnant from the storm. With impossible deliberation, the bear picked it up. It wasn't random. It knew what it was doing. The crew stood frozen as the bear, using its massive claws, began etching something into the wood. Slow, precise, intentional. When it was done, it lifted the plank in its mouth, carried it to Captain Harding, and placed it directly in his hands. Harding, his rough fisherman's hands shaking, turned it over. What he saw stole his breath away. Etched into the wood, crude yet unmistakable, was a circle. Inside it, 6 marks, 1 large, 5 smaller. 1 for the bear, 1 for each crew member. Bound together. No one spoke. No one could. Harding exhaled, his voice rough. It understands. The air felt charged, as if something monumental had just happened, something that shouldn't be possible, yet had. And then, at last, the bear turned. It stepped onto the ice, paws sinking into the frost. The crew half expected it to hesitate, to linger, but it didn't. At the edge of the ice, just before it disappeared into the Arctic expanse, it paused one final time. And then it raised one paw, not out of habit, not out of instinct. It was waving, a silence that said everything. No one moved for a long time after the bear was gone. The world felt different now, as if something sacred had passed through it. Emily was the first to break the silence. "That just happened, didn't it?" McGill let out a breathy laugh, still staring at the ice. "I don't know what just happened, but I know I'll never forget it." Jake rubbed a hand down his face. "We just lived through something that doesn't make sense." David Wu, the crew's quietest member, was staring at his camera screen. "I got it all," he murmured. "Every second of it." Captain Harding looked down at the wooden plank in his hands. The crude carving stared back at him, a symbol of something no scientist, no expert, no seasoned fisherman could ever truly explain. A message, a connection, something beyond understanding. Harding turned toward the crew, his voice quiet, certain. "This isn't the last time we'll see it." No one disagreed. Deep down, they all knew he was right. 3 days had passed since the Arctic dawn had released the polar bear back into the wild. 3 days since it had stepped onto the ice, turned one last time, and raised its paw in a final, undeniable farewell. And yet, as the ship returned to its usual fishing grounds, every crew member felt it, a presence that hadn't quite left them. Captain William "Bill" Harding stood at the helm, gripping the wheel with weathered hands. The ocean stretched before them, vast and indifferent, the way it had always been. But something about this journey felt different. It wasn't just that they had rescued a bear. It was what had happened after. The intelligence, the understanding, the connection. Harding didn't believe in fairy tales, but he knew when the sea was holding its breath. And right now it was. Then, just as the crew was beginning to settle into the routine of the day, Emily Carter, the first mate, the one who had first spotted the bear, gasped. She was standing near the bow, staring out at the distant ice floes, her binoculars frozen at her eyes. "Captain," she whispered, voice tight with something between shock and certainty, "you need to see this." Harding grabbed his own binoculars and followed her gaze. What he saw stopped his heart. A figure was moving through the water, gliding with impossible purpose. A polar bear. But not just any bear. Their bear. An unbelievable sight. The crew gathered along the railing, breath caught in their throats as they watched the scene unfold. The bear swam toward them with confidence, as if it knew exactly where it was going. But that wasn't what made the hair on the back of Harding's neck stand up. It was what was following behind it. A procession. At first it was hard to make out in the distance, but as the group drew closer, the details became unmistakable. A pod of orcas, black, fins slicing through the water, their movements synchronized like a choreographed dance. A swarm of seabirds, gulls and Arctic terns, circling above in deliberate patterns. And impossibly 2 more polar bears swimming alongside the first. The Arctic had many rules. But this broke them all. The ocean wasn't a place of unity. Different species didn't simply travel together, bears didn't lead, orcas didn't follow. And yet, here it was. Something no fisherman, no scientist, no explorer could ever explain. Miguel Alvarez exhaled. "This isn't happening." Jake Holloway ran a hand through his damp hair. "This is happening." Emily shook her head, eyes never leaving the scene. The bear. It brought them here. And then it did something even more incredible. A message, a gift, a miracle. As the bear neared the Arctic dawn, it slowed, treading water just feet from the ship's hull. For a long moment, it simply looked up at them. Then it dove beneath the surface. Harding's heart pounded. He half expected it to disappear, for the moment to slip away like a dream. But then, a shape emerged from the water. In its powerful jaws, the bear held something. A collection of seashells. Not just any seashells. They were pristine, unbroken, glistening in the fading Arctic light. And more unbelievably, each one matched the colors of the clothing the crew had worn on the day they rescued it. McGill's breath caught. No way. Emily pressed a hand to her chest. It remembered. One by one, the bear gently placed the shells into the water, letting the tide carry them toward the ship. A gift, a gesture. Not from instinct, not from habit, but from understanding. No one spoke. No one could. Then, as if to prove that this wasn't just a random act, the bear lifted its massive paw and placed it over its heart, the same gesture it had made the moment they saved it. The orcas breached, water sprang into the air in a synchronized motion. The birds shrieked in a perfect unison. And the two other bears, as if they too had learned this strange language, rose in the water and lifted their own paws, mirroring the motion of the first. The crew of the Arctic dawn had never seen anything like it. Harding clenched his jaw, gripping the ship's railing as a deep certainty settled into his bones. They had witnessed a miracle once before. Now it was happening again. And somehow he knew this was only the beginning. The world had changed. Not in a sudden, earth-shattering way, but in quiet, rippling waves. Waves that began the moment the Arctic dawn pulled back into harbor with a story that no one could explain. Captain William "Bill" Harding and his crew had witnessed something that defied nature, defied science, and defied everything they thought they knew about the Arctic. A polar bear had sought them out. A polar bear had helped them. A polar bear had led a procession of animals back to them. And then, in an act that shook even the most hardened skeptics, it had gifted them seashells, each one matched to a member of the crew. The story that wouldn't die. The moment Emily Carter uploaded the footage, the world took notice. What started as a simple video, just something to document what they had seen, exploded overnight. Millions of views. Then tens of millions. Then hundreds of millions. People weren't just watching, they were talking. Could animals communicate on a level we never understood? Could they form bonds with humans? Was this bear trying to tell us something? Marine biologists, animal behaviorists, and skeptics all pored over the footage, trying to find a logical explanation. Some called it coincidence. Some called it a hoax. But then the other stories started surfacing. Fishermen from the Arctic and beyond began sharing accounts that had never made the news, stories of animals helping them, of moments that felt too purposeful, too meaningful to dismiss. Whales warning ships of approaching storms. Seals guiding lost divers back to the surface. Bears returning to boats that had once rescued them, not for food, not for shelter, but as if to acknowledge something deeper. And the more people listened, the more they started to believe. The scientific response. Harding, a man who had built his life on logic and instinct, never imagined he would stand in front of scientists, journalists, and researchers from all over the world, telling them a story that sounded like something from folklore. Yet there he was. The footage, the carvings, the impossible gestures, it was all real. Some scientists dismissed it as anthropomorphism, claiming humans had a tendency to see intelligence where there was none. But others, especially those who had spent their lives studying wildlife, weren't so sure. Dr. Elliot Grayson, one of the world's leading researchers on animal cognition, publicly admitted, "This had been an isolated event, I might have dismissed it. but we are seeing a pattern, one that suggests intelligence and communication far beyond what we ever thought possible. And just like that, the debate changed. For the first time in history, researchers started asking different questions. Not, are animals intelligent? Because that was already proven. But rather, what if they understand more than we ever imagined? What if they are watching us, learning from us, just as we study them? The cultural shift. It wasn't just scientists who changed. The Arctic Dawn story sparked something deeper, a shift in how people saw the natural world. Governments in Arctic regions began implementing new protections for polar bears and marine wildlife, citing an undeniable need to preserve the balance of nature. Fishing communities, once wary of predators like polar bears, began to change their approach, moving from conflict to coexistence. Schools introduced the story of the Arctic Dawn into their environmental science curriculum, teaching children that the world was far more interconnected than they had ever been told. And perhaps most astonishingly, more reports started coming in. Whales leading boats away from reefs before they ran aground. Dolphins guiding lost swimmers toward the shore. Even bears, just like the one they had rescued, returning to the boats that had once helped them. Harding received hundreds of messages from sailors and fishermen, some from halfway across the world, telling their own stories of impossible encounters. What had begun as one event, one bear, had become something bigger, a movement. The bear's legacy. A year passed. Then 2. Then 5. And still the story of the Arctic Dawn and its bear never faded. A global conservation effort, the Guardian Initiative, was established. Its symbol? A polar bear's paw print placed over a heart. The same gesture the bear had made that first night on the ship. Harding and his crew became more than just sailors. They became ambassadors for a new understanding of wildlife. And then, on the 5th anniversary of the rescue, something happened that no one could have predicted. The Arctic Dawn was back in the same waters where they had first found the bear. The sea was calm, the air was still. Then, as the sun rose over the horizon, they saw it. A polar bear standing on the ice. Not just any bear, their bear. Older now, wiser, but still watching. And in its mouth, a piece of driftwood. The crew watched, silent, as the bear gently placed it in the water, letting it float toward them. Miguel pulled it from the waves with shaking hands. When he turned it over, they saw the carvings. Not just the circle from before. This time there were more marks inside it. More animals, more people, more connections. Harding closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. It had been right all along. This wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something bigger than any of them had ever imagined. The piece of driftwood lay in Miguel Alvarez's hands, the rough carvings still wet with Arctic seawater. But it wasn't just any carving. It was a message, a circle, just like the first one, but now with even more marks inside it. Not just for the crew of the Arctic Dawn, not just for the bear itself, but for others. More animals, more people. More connections. Captain William Bill Harding took the driftwood gently, running his calloused fingers over the grooves. This was not random. This was intentional. The bear, standing on the distant ice, watched them, waiting. Harding swallowed hard, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't since that first night when they pulled the bear from the freezing sea. Emily Carter's voice was barely above a whisper. It wants us to understand. And in that moment, they did. The final goodbye. The bear did not linger. It stood tall, the golden light of the rising sun framing its massive silhouette, and then it raised its paw one last time. That familiar gesture, that impossible, undeniable signal, not instinct, not imitation, understanding. The wind picked up, sending ripples across the water, as if the sea itself was acknowledging the moment. Then, without hesitation, the bear turned and walked away. Back toward the endless ice. Back toward whatever world it had come from. It did not look back, and somehow the crew knew it never needed to. A story that would never die. For a long time after the bear disappeared, no one spoke. The air felt charged, as if something unseen had just passed through it. Miguel finally let out a slow, shaky laugh. "You know." He glanced at Harding, still gripping the driftwood. "If we tell people about this, they'll never believe us." Harding smirked. They didn't believe us the first time either. But this wasn't just a story anymore. It was a legend. Emily exhaled, rubbing her arms as if trying to shake off the chill, not from the cold, but from the weight of what they had just witnessed. "Do you think it'll ever come back?" she asked softly. Harding looked down at the driftwood, at the new marks, at the message left behind. He didn't know how to explain it. Didn't know if it could be explained. But deep down, he was certain of one thing. It didn't need to come back, because it never really left. The unanswered mystery. Years later, the story of the Arctic dawn and its bear still lived on. Scientists studied it. Fishermen retold it. Children grew up hearing about it. But no one, not even the crew, ever found a logical explanation for what had happened. For the bear's unbelievable intelligence, for the seashell gifts, for the carved driftwood that now sat in a museum, still baffling experts. Some called it coincidence. Some called it a miracle. But the ones who were there, the ones who saw it firsthand, they just called it the truth. Some stories go beyond simple explanation. They leave behind questions that science cannot answer, but the heart understands perfectly. The story of the Arctic dawn and its bear reminds us that connection transcends language, species, and even logic. It teaches us that compassion, a single act of kindness, can ripple out in ways we may never fully grasp. This bear was not just saved, it chose to trust. It returned, bringing with it a message, not of fear, but of understanding. It reminded us that the natural world is not something separate from us, but woven into our existence, responding to how we treat it. For those of us who have spent decades watching the world change, this story is a reminder. Kindness is never forgotten. Connections matter, even in ways we don't always see. Sometimes the most important truths cannot be explained, only felt. Perhaps the bear was a symbol. Perhaps it was something more. But one thing is certain, the things we do today can echo far beyond our lifetime. Some stories stay with us forever, shaping the way we see the world. The tale of the Arctic dawn and its guardian is one of those. A reminder that kindness, trust, and connection transcend even the boundaries between species. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe to continue exploring extraordinary tales of friendship, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and nature.